So as you're moving, I will introduce myself. My name is Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. I'm the Climate Collaborations Editor for AP. I'm originally from Samoa in the South Pacific, so it is a great pleasure and privilege to say my tribal affiliation is Tuisafua tribe of the Savaii Islands in Samoa, something I'm never able to say in other global conferences, so this is great. Thank you for that opportunity. Before I start introducing our esteemed speakers here, I wanted to first honor and acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the elders and the chiefs of the land that we are on today. So it is also part of my culture to do the same, and so it is a great privilege to do so here. As I'm sure you've read the blurb, the brief for this event today, and it's really looking at climate change coverage from an Indigenous perspective, or rather the consideration of Indigenous issues and the nuanced approach by which we cover climate change from an Indigenous perspective. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our panel of speakers this afternoon. Starting from the far right, as I'm sure you all know, Tristan Ahtone is a member of the Kiowa tribe and is editor-at-large at Grist. He previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, Indian Country Today, and NPR, to name a few. Tristan's stories have won multiple honors, including a George Polk Award, a National Magazine Award nomination, and investigative awards from the Gannett Foundation and IRE, and he was also a past president of NAJA. And in 2017, he was a Neiman Fellow. Can we have a round of applause for Tristan? Next to Tristan is Matteo. Matteo is the oldest panelist in our group. Thank you for being here, Matteo. So he is a mixed race journalist of Cree and settler ancestry, working at the intersection of Indigenous affairs and climate. He lives and works in Ottawa, Ontario, on unceded Algonquin territory. Welcome, Matteo. And next to Matteo is Peter Prengaman. He is the Global Climate and Environment News Director for the AP, leading a team around the world dedicated to stories about climate change, from the impact on people to policy debates and green technologies. Prengaman has been with the AP for 21 years and has held several roles, from State House reporter to Oregon to bureau chief in Brazil. He has reported on and overseen big stories from more than 20 countries, including revolutions, ecological disasters, human tragedies, and major political shifts. Over the last several years, he has also had a large role helping oversee coverage of Indian country in the US and Indigenous peoples around the world. Between journalism assignments and linguistic studies, Peter has lived in about 10 years overseas in Brazil, Argentina, the Dominican Republic, Spain, Chile, and Morocco. I would like to see what your passport looks like with all of those. He is co-author of Dilma's Downfall, The Impeachment of Brazil's First Woman President and the Pathway to Power for Jair Bolsonaro's Far Right. I am part of Peter's team, and I'm glad to say that actually the Global Climate Desk is the most diverse team in all of AP. So let's give him a round of applause for that. It's one thing to talk and quite another to walk that very talk. So I'm happy to be part of that team. And last but most certainly not the least, Joaqlin Estus. Thank you so much for being here with us today. She is the national correspondent at ICT, formerly India Country Today, for 3 years based in Anchorage, Alaska. She started reporting in 1991 as an intern for Alaska Public Radio Network, then worked in several public radio stations, including KTOO in Juneau, Alaska, Minnesota Public Radio, and KNBA, a native-owned and operated station in Anchorage. Now, what's interesting is when I sat down with her to write her bio this morning, she just gave me 2 affiliations. I said, didn't you do like a show devoted to climate change at KNBA? She's like, yes, I did that. I said, weren't you the news director for a while? She goes, yes, I was that too. So she was the news director at KNBA, where she reported on native and issues and climate issues. So please welcome Joaqlin. And may I please invite everyone who just arrived and seated on this side, if you could kindly move to the front so we can actually speak to you. Thank you so much. Okay, and now to the exciting, very nerdy thing that I've been looking forward to from our panel. So just to recap, my name is Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. I am the Climate Collaborations Editor at AP. We are also joined here today by our team members, Brian Pollard, who is with our Indigenous and Partnerships desk, and Corinne, who is in diversity, and a few others in the room. So the AP family is here with you. And now to begin, as I've mentioned before, this panel is about the coverage of climate change from an Indigenous perspective. But first, just to get a feel of the speakers, I would like to ask our speakers to share what drew them to climate reporting, to reporting on climate change as a journalist. So let's start with, maybe let's start from you, Tristan, and then we'll go from there.
I wish I had like an inspiring answer, but I just needed a job. But I can say that I think what's made me stick with it is just really realizing and seeing, as we all know, the impacts of climate change in the environment. And I think what interests me most, obviously, is really the structural problems that reporting on environment and climate start to reveal when you're actually in it and reporting on it regularly. It's an endlessly interesting area to be reporting in, but I think most importantly, nowadays I think of my job quite differently in reporting on environment and climate, obviously because it's such a pressing issue that I really think on some level it's a matter of advocacy that we're reporting on, advocacy for the planet, for our communities, et cetera, to be reporting on what those issues are, solutions, et cetera, because it's going to kill all of us. So,
on that
so
high
I'll start
note,
there. We'll just go.
note.
It's just all uphill from here, I promise. So.
Matteo, bring us some hope, please.
Yeah, so I guess I'll take the kind of role of the inspiring answer. But so when I was a student journalist in Guelph, I really just kind of joined self-interestedly. Like I just wanted to write for a living, make a little bit of money from writing. And then I guess the first kind of real story that I really became excited about, or the first story that I felt kind of real meaning and obligation and commitment to, was writing on our university's divestment movement. Divestment from fossil fuels. So I know a lot of activists in the movement, so I was having a lot of off-the-record conversations. I went up to the VP of Finance's room and got to grill him. It was really weird. He gave me this ugly yellow shirt from the university right when I walked in the door. I didn't go to J school, so I had no sense of journalism ethics. So I was like, sure, I'll take this yellow shirt. This is great. I was grilling him about why are you divesting? So yeah, it felt really good. And eventually, when I left a couple years later, they committed to divestment. So it felt like climate was kind of one of the first kind of commitments or obligations I really had as a journalist, and I find meaning from that. And I reporting on policing and carceral, a little bit of arts and culture writing, then of course on Indigenous stories. And at the university as well, I wrote this kind of editorial about the death and killing of Colton Bushi, this young man who died on the side of the roads from a farmer. doing things that any kind of teenagers would in any community. So I wrote this editorial and got this nasty email from this guy getting really angry. It didn't feel good, but in a sense it felt right. So that kind of intersection of like challenging, the assumptions of the Canadian public while also having that commitment and obligation to saving the climate, the most existential threat, as Tristan said, we're all going to die. But yeah, that's
you.
me.
Thank you.
Well, I'll try to be a little more hopeful, guys. I don't think we're all going to die. I do think there are a lot of positive things happening that give us hope, at least hope that those things can change. I think for me, years before I knew it, I was developing as a climate focused reporter. Early in my career, I noticed, particularly working overseas in the Caribbean, I saw this a lot, where weather event disasters would really impact poor people much more than anything else. And in those days, we're talking 10, 15 years ago, we didn't even really associate them with climate change, right? Of course, climate change was around. People knew about it, but it wasn't so much in the vernacular. So I think that's one thing that really drew me. And I also, early in my career, helped cover the Gulf oil spill, and off the coast of Louisiana, where the oil was just gushing and gushing and gushing. And so I got a really good sense of environmental impacts from that, and how complicated it was too, because from the outside you might look at it and say, oh, there's the oil, it's bad. Look at how much it's hurting people. But even in the middle of that crisis, a lot of people whose livelihoods had been devastated supported oil. And I think, for me, that was an early lesson of just how complicated the environmental story, climate stories are. And so just over the years, like more and more, I did stories as a reporter, as an editor, and really came to see climate as so complicated, filled with trade-offs, filled with amazing human stories, filled with amazing science, and I think I like the complicated piece of it. And I think that really drew me to it, that and people.
Thanks, Peter.
So I'm from Alaska, and climate change is happening there at 2 to 4 times the rate in the Arctic as the rest of the planet. So it's really in your face. There are 30-some villages that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers say won't last another 20 years. They'll be flooded. And, if you get the chance to visit the village, it's one thing to hear that it's a little place, with 400 people, but then you go there and you see that it's got a heart and community and schools, power plants, homes, and all of that is at risk. And so, and then Alaska the Arctic has 2 things happening that are in a positive loop. So as sea ice melts, it leads to more sea ice melting, and then as permafrost melts, that leads to more permafrost melting. So it's kind of escalating as time goes on. So as an Alaska reporter, it was something it was right there. Like I said, it was right in my face. And I'm happy to cover it. Like you were saying, there's so many aspects to it.
Thank you, Joaqlin. I think it's fair to say that there's a number of reasons that everyone chose the beat. Speaking of, being right there in the face, I chose to report on climate because I was born and brought up on an island. And so when cyclones and sea level rise is your reality every day, you kind of, when you choose your career, you also focus on it from that perspective. So now that we know what drew you to climate reporting, let's get to understanding. Now, our speakers here are from a range of news organizations, from national to local. I would like to just briefly ask them about their organization's respective existing coverage on climate and Indigenous issues. So you have that background knowledge of where they come from in terms of the journalism background that they represent. So let's start with you, Joaqlin. How is covering climate from an Indigenous perspective apologies. Can you tell us about your organization's coverage of climate and Indigenous communities?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And Jordan helped me. Jordan, what's your job title again? Editor. Editor-in-chief. So I kind of grilled her this morning, asking her about this and other questions, and thanks so much for your input. So one of the things that we hit on is that Indian country is not monolithic. And as you talk to different groups, you find out that every kind of perspective imaginable is represented. Something that Tristan mentioned that we try to do is show the economic, social, and regulatory changes that are preventing any real solid action on climate change. And we talk about self-determination in dealing with climate change, the importance of the role of Indigenous people in the science around climate change, and then the strength of communities in facing this, the resilience of our people in facing climate change.
Thank you.
I think I'll take that in two parts because there's a lot of overlap between those coverage areas, but they're also separate and lots of different issues. The climate team that I oversee, we are 25 people around the world, and we do a mix of stories, everything from impact, extreme weather, to policy changes. We follow pretty closely the IRA and the money being doled out. We focus on climate migration, people who are being forced to move. And as part of what we do, we also do many stories on Indian country and large or indigenous peoples around the world, because there's a lot of intersection between climate change and native peoples. So that's sort of the climate and environment piece. And then at the AP, we also cover, and I know this because in my previous position at AP, I was news director of the Western US. And so this is where I got to really work on and learn a lot about Indian country because there's so many stories in the West, on Native Americans. So we have pretty robust coverage. We had a reporter, Felicia Fonseca, who many of you know, who's a real expert in tribes. She's taken on now a leadership role, and so we don't have her reporting, but she's infusing a lot of that into the report, and in the Southwest, and I know AP is working on building out its coverage of Native Americans in general. So those two things I think are separate, but there's just a lot of overlap, and we'll get into, I think, a little bit later some of the stories where that overlaps.
I'll take this one. Switching up every time. So CNO, Canada's National Observer, I'll just shorten it because Canada's National Observer is a mouthful, but we started in 2009 as a kind of small Vancouver publication. We went national in 2015, precisely because there was such a gap in the Canadian media market for environmental reporting. Even our newspapers of record, like the Globe and Mail, until recently are still kind of writing editorials about the importance of oil and gas in Canada. You can make an economic argument all you want, but I think for us as a kind of climate forward publication, we're really trying to follow the money and show this is the science, I get this is the money, but, and then of course, when we talk about Indigenous communities, very much a lot of overlap, especially in Canada. So I think I'm one of the first, if not the first, kind of Indigenous specific beats. But of course, we've had the fantastic Julian Brave Noise Cat in our pages as a columnist, Karen Pugliese, who is our former editor-in-chief, incredible journalist, contracting out, Brandy Moran's working on a project. So, and then of course, when we talk about climate, you can't ignore Indigenous communities. We talk a lot about in our pages sacrifice zones. We talk about environmental racism. I mean, just go down to, we were writing stories on Sarnia and Chemical Valley, the kind of largest kind of concentration of petrochemical plants in North America, and what's in the middle of it? First Nations. So I think it's almost impossible to write about climate in Canada without having the intersection of Indigenous communities, whether it's Wet'suwet'en, the oil sands itself, Fairy Creek, and so on. There's so many stories just popping up every single day and month. So, yeah.
At Grist, we cover environment and climate exclusively, so that's our entire coverage area. So for me, it's building an Indigenous affairs desk more or less inside a non-native outlet that's already focused specifically on climate and environment. But I think what makes us a little bit different is that while we're looking at systems of inequality that climate change illuminates, we're really trying to make sure that we're taking a rights-based approach when we're doing our reporting in Indigenous communities around the world. You know, we really try to, I mean, we do all of our coverage with Indigenous readers in mind. This is our entire way of operating, that we want to make sure that we're not explaining like Indigenous communities for non-native audiences. We're really thinking about that Indigenous communities around the world may not know each other very well, so that's who we're explaining things to. But that does make a big difference in terms of how we're thinking about explaining our communities, our stories, our struggles, and whatnot. But it's all to say that really one of the areas that we look at are solutions, but we don't really kind of follow the sort of solutions journalism style of like, look at this interesting thing that people are doing, and isn't that something? Like, that's not our thing. We're really thinking about like, what are rights-based approaches to Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty that can have real impacts and real effects on climate and environment in positive ways. And as y'all can guess, obviously that gets into where conflicts arise between knowing what the science is, knowing what the rights recognition should be, and governments and states that refuse to actually recognize those rights or employ the science that's coming out. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration, but also reason for doing what we do comes from, is pushing back on that and really fighting those narratives and those viewpoints.
Well, thank you, Tristan. I think that's really an important point you make on the difference in coverage and the way you approach it based on the disc. I've done most of my career as a journalist was reporting from the Pacific Islands, and when you're reporting in a country where that is happening, you don't have to explain or attribute. It just is. The climate crisis is causing this for our communities. That's why you're displaced and all of that. To then transition to global media and then having to explain that my country is indeed a country that has human beings on it that speak a whole language and has a whole, like, you know, it's sovereign and it's got its own self-governance. It is a big difference. And so when you get into climate coverage, you know, there are nuances to that when you cover in different Indigenous communities, and that's where our next question lies. So how, I'm just going to ask this question to our panelists, how is covering climate from an Indigenous perspective different to that of mainstream coverage? And I think we're going really well with the way that we're starting from left to right and then right to left, so let's keep that energy up. Joaqlin, do you mind starting?
Sure. So, I mean, I feel really lucky that I've lived in Alaska most of my life, and I've been involved in the Native community and, you know, as a part of it and as a reporter for most of my life. So I know a lot of the players, and I remember when they were, you know, different people. They were young and were growing and changing. And now they've turned into a force, and it's really exciting and interesting to see that play out at the Alaska Federation of Natives convention, for instance, where people adopt resolutions and have, you know, lively debates, sometimes heated debates about them. So it really helps to know your community, and that takes a lot of time. And I would say that, oh, and the other thing is about cultures, you know, understanding that people, so one example is the Willow Project, an oil and gas development project on the North Slope of Alaska. There are Inupiaq people who support it and some who oppose it. Well, they represent two really different types of entities. The village corporations that were created under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act to make money and issue dividends to their shareholders. And then you have villages, which, you know, have IRAs, Indian Reorganization Act, village councils, and they perform governmental services for their people. So it's, you know, I guess it's hitting on that message again that the Native community is not monolithic, and it helps to know the history of the different organizations, especially in Alaska.
I'd say a few things to answer that question. You know, different than what you talked about, Tristan. You know, we at AP are a general news organization, so we are writing for the most general readers. And the reality is, a lot of general readers don't know a whole lot about, you know, Indigenous peoples. So we have to build into our stories a lot of explanation that may seem, you know, boring or sort of like, oh, yeah, of course, to people who are from those communities. But I think if we do it in the right way, we're doing that not in a simplistic way, and doing it from the perspective of the people that we're writing about. I think that's really important. If you're doing stories about communities, the voices need to be from that community, like first and foremost. And to your point about, you know, people not being a monolith, I mean, that's really the case. That's really important to as much as you can in stories, show the full breadth of opinions from a tribe or, you know, a group of people in an area. So I think we do have to do some translating, but hopefully not in a simplistic way. I'd give one example of a story we worked on recently, which kind of went all around these pieces. We did a story on the Yanomami tribe in Brazil and Venezuela. It's huge territory. If you've read the news, you know, and followed anything that's happening, it's a peoples that has been devastated the last several years, particularly by gold mining. People moving into the territory, illegally mining, illegally deforesting, diseases, all kinds of things that you can imagine. And we have a correspondent who's focused on the Amazon, and he realized that this gold company called Cartier and Cartier Foundation was using the Yanomami image in ways that the Yanomami didn't know about to basically advertise their gold. And it was a complicated story in that there's Cartier, right, the gold maker, and then there's the Cartier Foundation. And the Cartier Foundation supports a lot of the art of Yanomami. And so within this tribe, you had people who were supportive of Cartier because they support their art and the foundation. But then other tribal leaders, when they found out from this reporter, like, hey, did you know these children were used in this particular ad online, who was really angry about it and submitted a complaint with the public prosecutor's office in Brazil. And so I think that story is a really good example of just how complicated sometimes things are within a tribe. So look that one up, Yanomami, Brazil, Associated Press. It's a really good one.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback here from my colleagues, and I think that's very important. I think the nuance on writing on this intersection is precisely writing on the kind of dual crises of colonization and the climate crisis, and something that we need to absolutely braid. Whether or not we're talking about material conditions of nations and what that kind of leads to, and the tensions that arrive from that, particularly around resource development. I mean, for example, our organization's turning our eyes towards the Ring of Fire. For some reason, a mining exploration person named it after Johnny Cash, but basically it's this huge development project right in the middle of a muskeg, like a huge carbon sink. and the government saying the duty to consult was made because they found two nations that are supportive of the project, because they want a road to their communities to have kind of all-around access. They're flying communities, so the material conditions are absolutely real, and when resource development projects come in, and whether or not start showing large coin purses, whether or not they're good deals or not, it's something that communities have to think about, and their leadership have to think about, because it's colonization. This land was dispossessed, this wealth was dispossessed, and now it's kind of like, here's some crumbs. So I think linking those two things and not necessarily vilifying, it's kind of easy to make that kind of villain. The fossil fuel corporate CEOs are kind of an easy kind of figure to point out, but it gets a lot more complicated when we're talking about, the big coin word right now is economic reconciliation in Canada. Everyone's talking about reparations right now, but everyone's talking about economic reconciliation. So, really trying to reveal how the climate crisis and colonization are intertwined, and have been for years since contact.
I think what makes our reporting a little bit different is echoing what Joaqlin said about sort of knowing your community and knowing sort of what's going on. I mean, a good example is just being curious and sort of applying some critical application to when you see a news release. So I'll give an example. Last year California offered $100 million for land back purposes, right? For tribes in California to buy land and put it into protected area status. It's 200 tribes in California. You can do the math on this. This isn't a lot of money, but everybody was reporting the story about this is a success. It's $100 million, and it's just asking a simple question of what's the math on that? It's not a lot, and it's California real estate. You're not gonna this isn't a story of success. This is a story of a PR campaign, basically. But I think maybe more generally, what I think it makes us different in terms of how we're thinking about reporting on climate, reporting in Indigenous communities, and the intersection of colonialism and imperialism is that I think of all climate stories as more or less stories about the failures and / dangers of capitalism. And I think that this is really the area that we should be discussing a lot more as reporters, is that, we are trained to say that we don't have an opinion on this stuff, but we continue to report stories within the binary of capitalism. That there's a question of lithium mining. Is it good for the environment? Is it good for the economy? When we're always coming back to all roads lead to this one place every single time. And I think that when we're looking at the future of what reporting and journalism looks like, we really need to start examining our own biases about why we're not sort of mentioning the elephant in the room here, which is capitalism in every single sense of almost every story that we do. And I think that's something that we're really trying to hint toward and work toward, but obviously have to be very careful in our industry about how we do this, and especially in the United States, where they'll hit you with sticks and rocks if you say anything that's not about capitalism. So these are things that we have to think about. But it is something I wish that our industry was talking a lot more about we say that we're objective, but we refuse to question this one particular situation that and this one economic policy that is more or less destroying everything that we love.
So I translate your sticks and stones perhaps as cancel culture as well? No?
No, that's just Americans generally. Americans are generally trained for this kind of stuff. I mean, haven't you seen the Rocky movies?
Yes. I don't see all those trucks everywhere. Okay. Because, in Samoa, if you write the wrong story, you'll literally get thrown stones at you. So I hear that in a different way. So while we're at the plugging phase, since Peter started it, speaking of Grist's work, Grist is doing, really amazing work that translates the science of climate for broader audiences, which includes the use of graphics, illustrations, and so forth. And we just completed an amazing collaboration with them on climate and health, where we looked at the impacts of climate and health globally from different communities. So that's just my plug. It's out there. But a very good way of explaining the difference between Indigenous, the coverage of climate from Indigenous versus mainstream is, for me, when a forest burns in a community, a writer from the US, mainstream, might say trees, might reference the loss of trees and the ecosystems within that particular forest area, or the impact on the communities, whereas an Indigenous writer or Indigenous perspective would reference the loss to, say, traditional medicine, plants, sacred sites, traditional wear that comes from those trees, and any cultural assets within it. So the implications to cultural practice and cultural norms, those are, that's what makes climate coverage from an Indigenous perspective for me different. Okay, now we'll have a follow-up question. And I just want to ask, now that we've spoken about what makes, Indigenous perspective covering climate different, do you have examples from your past work or from your organizations that you can highlight? You can even maybe let them know what the link would be or how to search it so that they can pull it up while you're talking about that particular story. So I think because Matteo looks like he's really excited about this particular question, I'm going to ask him to go first.
Yeah, fortunately, nervousness looks like excitement the same way. But okay, so I've been doing a lot of reporting on nuclear, particularly around nuclear waste, and I think this is a really interesting story. Canada's gearing up to build a giant hole in the ground to store the entire country's nuclear waste through ice ages. They're going to make an announcement in March 2024. They have kind of two sites selected. One of them is kind of in southern Ontario, where I live and work. It's where the most nuclear, I think 50% of Ontario's power grid is nuclear. In the South Bruce, so like near Lake Huron, a little bit 150 kilometers west of Toronto. And then another site is in northern Ontario. This is interesting. I mean, in climate spaces, it's controversial, but nuclear is seen as somewhat of a solution. Has a waste problem, but it burns clean. But the southern site that they're going to build historically has been just a lot of legacy issues. So they built this giant nuclear reactor, biggest in Canada, without even talking with the local nations. They just kind of woke up with a nuclear reactor next door where they harvest. So again, there's this history of colonization and a history of capital, and kind of powering the great kind of factories of southern Ontario. The other side is in northern Ontario. It's kind of right before you start moving towards a lot of the flying communities. The local nations have made, in Treaty 3, have made agreements with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, but the NAN chiefs that are further north have came out vehemently opposed to it, is what they called in the resolution, because a lot of those waterways go up north towards the James Bay. So again, it's this great conversation around like, okay, how are we going to? And a lot of these nuclear companies are private entities, so it's a great question of like, okay, whether governments are picking and choosing in terms of who to consult. So they're already making I think the term I hear a lot is divide and conquer in my reporting, in terms of consultation. But then there's also the kind of money is involved, right? I was talking to the chief in the southern nation, and she was saying, if they don't get the repository, the deep geological repository is what they're called, they're going to miss out on a lot of millions of dollars that can go into help supporting a lot of the programs they have. And so she's hoping, they haven't discussed this yet, but she's even hoping that if they don't get chosen, they still get some money. I mean, they live and work right beside a nuclear reactor too, right? So it's not like they're going to be totally safe from nuclear anyway. So it's a really complex story, a lot of moving parts. But I think it's right at this intersection of nuance and climate and energy transition and so on. So, yeah, that's my story.
Oh, is it me? Sure. Okay. What was the question again? Examples, that's right. Okay. Yeah, we've got a series running right now called the Human Cost of Conservation that's looking at protected areas and the establishment of protected areas around the world under 30 by 30. And I'm sure most folks are familiar with it, but the 30 by 30 agreement is more or less preserving 30% of the world's land and waters for conservation. And it's been obviously hailed as like a really big move, a huge success for the world to kind of come together on. But from our perspective, when we start looking at the data and information, most of those lands that are being slated for conservation are near or in Indigenous communities. And y'all are already aware of this, here in Canada and the U.S., the establishment of any of the national parks in the United States, for instance, require the removal and dispossession of Indigenous peoples of their land for this conservation status. And we're seeing it happen across the planet right now. Because, we're counting down, it was 7 years to hit 30%, and I think we're at like 17% more or less. Like, there's not a lot of places that you're going to get the land to do this, right? You're not going to knock down apartment complexes near Central Park in New York to reach that goal. You're going to find some place where people don't have power, and you're going to find some place where people aren't watching, that you can conserve these areas. And we're seeing extreme levels of violence in parts of Central Africa, Southern Asia, Central and South America, less so here in the US and Canada, but this is an example, I think, of something that we are really interested in continuing to follow up, because obviously, there's a ton of money that's involved with this. There are huge international organizations that are deeply, deeply committed to putting in finance and money into establishing these protected areas. And almost every step of the way, it's going to require the dispossession of Indigenous people of their lands around the world. And more or less, the idea here is that Indigenous peoples have contributed the least to climate change are being asked to sacrifice the most. And in most places are being asked to sacrifice it with militarized conservation tactics. So I think that's an example of something that we're really thinking about. And I feel like we've been kind of an outlier when it comes to the 30 by 30 reporting out there, because it's been hailed as such a big accomplishment. And it's a small group of us saying, hold on just a second. We've even put out calls for additional reporting and taking freelance pitches. Everybody here, same goes for you. We're really interested in working with folks around the world to be reporting this stuff out. And we're really having a hard time finding people who want to get into this stuff, which is, I find very, very strange that we have like money and resources to say, let's look at let's do some investigating around these protected areas. And we're having a hard time doing this. So I guess that's at least one example of where we're looking at accountability, rights, conservation, climate, environment, everything really, just colliding with each other, basically.
I think the example that I'll give is a recent reporting trip and story that we did around the Thacker Pass. Of course, this is not, a new story. There's been a debate for a long time, but I really like what we did in this case, because we sent an all formats team there. We spent about a week with some of the tribes that are impacted, really got their point of view as to why they don't want lithium mining in this particular place. Again, as we spoke about, not a monolith. Some people are supportive because of the hoped for economic benefits that it would bring. But the story really took a complicated, nuanced look at all of these things, because in part of the Thacker Pass area where they want to develop the lithium and construction has started, it's the site of a burial, a massacre. And so that's very sensitive. So you have that piece of it, you have the economic development piece of it. As part of this story, we were able to do a sit-down interview with Deb Holland, where she basically tried to, split the baby a little bit and, say that she supports protests, but this is important because of the Biden administration green transition plans. So, super complicated all around that brings out a lot of the themes that we're talking about here.
Something that's different about Alaska is that people live, I think, to a much greater extent than in other parts of the country. They live off the land. It's not that the land is, well, the land is bountiful. And in rural areas, the cost of shipping food out is so high. And so people harvest seals, walrus, whales, caribou, and salmon. And people are accustomed to getting hundreds of salmon and putting them in the freezer and smoking and drying them and putting them in jars. And something that's come up in western Alaska is the Donlin gold mine, which would be an enormous open pit mine. And if any of you have covered open pit mines, you know that there's a lot of waste. I mean, mountains of waste that has to be managed in perpetuity, which means eternally. And, you know, we can't even manage nuclear waste from 50 years ago, much less for eternity. So we have, however, 2 native corporations that own land. They own the land where the gold is, and so they support the mining operation. And the Regional Health Corporation, local tribes and villages have all come out in opposition. And so this is just, it's an example of how an ancient way of life is being threatened by modern development. And this is in the context of the salmon fisheries declining to the point that it's unbelievable. I mean, you know, people used to catch thousands of fish, and now the fisheries is shut for king salmon is shut down. It's, I mean, I don't know where you live, but maybe you're from Washington and, you know, you're famous for apples, or North Dakota for wheat, or Alberta for canola, you know, whatever your area is famous for producing. Just imagine if not only that was gone, possibly forever, but you were having to import it. That's the kind of thing that we're looking at with salmon, and it's because it's multiple factors related to climate change. The streams where they spawn are too warm. There are flash floods that wipe out the eggs from the gravel. There's, the ocean is warming. There's less prey food for the salmon when they're at sea, and so on and so forth. So it's like the whole world is changing, and it's coming down to putting food on the table in rural Alaska. So anyway, that's an example of a story that I've been covering.
Oh, thank you, Joaqlin. Yeah, now let's, I'm just going to ask the audience, we're just going to break now to questions from the audience. So if you have any, we'll open up the floor for 2 questions. If you want to address it directly to one of the speakers, or if you want everyone to answer, you're welcome to do so. Owen left the room. Go ahead. Owen was that RT person.
I'm wondering, Tristan is. Elaborate a little bit more on that. Well, as Tristan noted, we're really talking.
Okay, so since I started it, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, we think of it as a symptom, not a problem. We you know, if climate change is magically fixed tomorrow, all of the same problems still exist, right? You know, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, et cetera. All of these things still exist if climate change is fixed tomorrow. So we do see it as a symptom. I don't know if that is being widely accepted at other outlets. I don't know. I'd love to hear what you all think about this as well too. But I think that it's only been in the last few years that news organizations have started sort of saying, well, we'll have climate desks or we'll have it as a little beat that we do. It is obviously very, very complex area from science to sort of background here, but I don't know. I mean, I think maybe you're asking a larger question about just journalism generally, about like what it is that reporters do, why they do what they do, and sort of like their own like built-in biases and systems that are sort of in place, right? But I think for us, we think of it as a symptom, which gives us a lot more areas to be able to sort of report in and push a lot harder on, I think. I don't know. I mean, again, like we've heard a number of times that this is complicated. These areas are really complicated. To some degree, I would like break ranks with my colleagues here and say I don't actually think it's all that complicated. Like I think like these mining projects, for instance, is this idea of like, oh, this community, there's we're not monolithic, and there's disagreements in the community over whether or not this mine needs to go in because it'll provide revenue to like the community. But we're not talking still about we hear land back all the time, right? We know that dispossession of indigenous lands is one of the primary like economic livelihood destroyers, that if we don't have access to our lands, we can't build economies, right? So the fact that we've got communities that have treaties with the United States that the United States won't follow, won't return land, et cetera, is that there are alternatives in terms of like what building an economy can be in a community. But as long as you make sure that you cannot return land, you cannot return resources, and the only option you have is a mine, of course there's going to be a problem there. And to me, I don't think that's actually that complicated. That just looks like colonialism to me, right? Again, I think this has been a thing in my entire career, no matter what beat I've been in, is that this question and these like binaries don't necessarily exist. It's just whether or not journalism will allow us to think outside of that or report outside of that.
Thanks. Does anyone else in the panel want to address the question?
Well, we have Mark Trahant is an economics reporter for ICT, and he's been looking at how the marketplace works. And I think that, and so when you start getting into what is it a symptom of, it's kind of like it's symptomatic of the worldview that everybody has. And it's not just, I mean, I know one couple that doesn't have a car and they heat with wood, which is not the best way, but their house is like 550 square feet. They're the only people I know who, and I know there are many, many others, but I live in a condo and I keep it heated in the wintertime and I drive a car. So there's, the whole issue of how much are we really, until solutions come along that allow, and many of us flew here. So there's changes that have to happen at a very personal, fundamental level. And then there's things like the marketplace, being able to ask a broker to manage your portfolio so that, the social ramifications of the stock that you're buying reflect your values. And then there's things like the legal and regulatory infrastructure. So the Army Corps of Engineers cannot work to relocate a village. It can only work to protect it. And this is such a huge, huge issue because they're the main player in the whole game when it comes to protecting yourself against floods and that kind of thing. So it's, I think that's a really good question. It's something that's hard to get at in your reporting, but I think it's important that we do.
I mean, I've only kind of thought about your question for 5 minutes, so this is like a hot take. But I think what we try to do in our reporting is see climate change as both a problem and a symptom, because I mean it's definitely a problem, right? I mean we know it very clearly. the more greenhouse gases go up into the atmosphere, the more the planet heats, the more, we see alterations in the climate. That's a problem. But I think I particularly think of climate this way, and our team does, we talk a lot about this, is it's like the great accelerator, the great exacerbator, because it does put a spotlight on all the kind of problems that exist already. Like Tristan said, if we solve climate change, these problems would still be there. A lot of these problems would still be there. So I think we try to approach both, and with some nuance, because there are things that you can look at differently. Like you said, Tristan, it's not a binary, like you develop this land or you don't. No, you could give this land back. You could let it be developed in a different way. Things like that, you can see more complicated. But there are other things, like you said, we all flew here, right? I mean, this building is climate controlled. We all have our coffee. Those are disposable cups over there. So, I mean, I think that we also have to keep in mind that it's not just capitalism at the back, but also just consumption in general. And more we do try to infuse that into our reporting, because those are larger questions. I mean, when it comes to conferences, a big question some people are starting to ask is, should we even do them? Because we bring all these people together. We talk about important things, but it's not great for the climate. So anyway, that's my hot take on that. 5 minutes.
I just want to piggyback. I think, Tristan's absolutely right. I mean, when we talk about the nuances in Canada, at least, even a country that passed UNDRIP into law, no doesn't mean no. It's, like there's no veto power at all. And if you do say no as a nation, continue to say no and take a stand, you're going to be surveyed by the RCMP. You're going to have court injunctions. It's green colonialism. And as we move forward with the transition, it's, Beacon does a great hope, but mining is going to ruin a lot of harvesting and land in general. And I think, in Canada, we talk about IPCAs. Here, the premiers, want to keep mining open even in indigenous protected areas. So if we, it's being kind of hailed as a solution for reconciliation and for the climate. But if we're opening this up for mining, I mean, it's kind of PR at a certain point. So I think absolutely when we talk about capital, I mean, Canadian government just invested $10 billion plus for car batteries. I mean, if we keep up the amount of cars we're building, but just electric, I mean, not much is going to change. It's just going to be the same stories, so on and so forth.
But can I just add, that's why this is such a great beat, right? Because it creates all these problems, but we all have cell phones here, we all have our computers. I mean, we're all part of, in a sense, we're all part of the problem, right? And so I think our reporting needs to be nuanced and, really try to push those questions for all of us, for readers and in our own lives.
Well, thank you for that great question, and thanks for the answers to our speakers. Do we have another burning question from the floor? Go ahead, in front of you. No pun intended. Does anyone want to address the question? We don't all have to go, but if anyone would like to, this is good.
Well, I can't answer that question very well, but I did want to put in a plug for journalism in general, and just say that the more people who are out there who are trying to cover this, the better. I mean, one of the big challenges that we have at ICT is picking the stories because there are so many, and there are, you know, not unlimited resources. By the way, we are going to be advertising for a climate reporter in the next 6 months or so.
There's a lot of plugging going on in this panel here. I feel like we should be charging. And Matteo, do you want?
Yeah, I'll just plug my colleagues'
Here
work
we go.
really quick. My colleague John Woodside last year he followed followed the money and reported a lot on the banks and their investments in fossil fuels. And you know, business is kind of a fickle game, but you know there is a wing of people that believe a lot of these are stranded assets and white elephants. So I mean there are people arguing for one angle for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I caught the bit about simplifying and trying to make this a relatable topic. This was the struggle we had with climate reporting 10, 15 years ago, was trying to convince editors that this is a worthwhile topic to pursue and it is a serious issue. So I feel like we tried to tackle it then. And it's really contextualizing it within the communities that you're reporting to. And I'm just using the Indigenous lenses at the moment. And then this segues to our next question on challenges and languages. Now, one of the challenges I've always found in doing justice to a climate story, especially from an Indigenous community, is how do you effectively report on the impacts of climate on a community without knowing the language and the nuances and the cultural norms of that particular community? Well, you can't if you are a parachute journalist, if you are a correspondent. You simply do not have the historical and cultural understanding to do justice to that story. But we do have creative ways of, addressing it. So it's not a plug, but it's an example of something that we did recently that touches on your question, but also at the discussion of challenges. We reported, we did a collaboration with the Press Trust of India in Kochi, which is the southern part of India, in April this year. And we reached out to our partner there to select journalists from their local newsrooms and correspondents, Indian correspondents, in small towns, and link them up with our editors and our senior journalists to support them in covering a story on climate in their community that they've always wanted to tell but never had the opportunity or resources to do so. I was partnered with a local climate journalist. Gaurav was his name, really cool dude. His perception of time and distance is very different to mine, but that in itself was a cultural nuance. When he said to me, we're meeting in 1 hour, it was actually 3 hours, and when he said it's only a 15-minute drive, it was like we crossed 3 islands by a very, in a taxi that had no business being on the road at all. It was barely, but that was, and we got to this area, we were covering a fisherman who had planted over 10,000 mangroves in the past 10 years out of pure passion and understanding that it buffers sea level rise and storm surges on his village. But he spoke a particular dialect that was only understood by about 10% of people in that particular region. So we had to find someone who understood his dialect and spoke the regional dialect, who then could speak to the regional dialect person who could translate it to English. So in the interview, we had a 3-way translation. But that was because we really needed to hear from him and in his language. And we didn't want to get someone who could barely understand him and barely translate it. No, we wanted to get the true meaning of his words. So which meant we had to get someone who was native in that dialect to translate to the regional dialect, and then the regional dialect person to then translate to English. It was a very long interview as a result, but it was fun. So I think that's, I don't know if this answers your question, but it's one way to do justice to a community's issues when covering climate change. So that is a challenge, and it was definitely language related. And that's the next question I have. And I know I shared this with you all, but can you address a challenge, that you face in covering climate from an Indigenous perspective or in Indigenous communities, and perhaps a way that you have, addressed it and overcame that challenge? I will, I guess, start with Tristan.
We've been running something called the Global Indigenous Affairs Desk here for a little bit now at Grist, which is more or less set up as a collaboration point. So we've been working with ICT, Manga Bay, Native News Online, HCN, really pulling resources to do a lot of climate coverage across borders and with an Indigenous focus. But I think maybe one of the biggest issues, we work as globally as we possibly can, but obviously language is a huge issue. We are very cognizant of not parachuting into communities if we can at all help it. And also, frankly, because of the nature of the work that we do, which is usually kind of featurey, if we don't speak the language to be able to do a feature, we kind of just don't do it. Mainly because for us, we need characters, we need story, we need all of the different elements, to really bring those to life in feature form. And as you guys know, when you're out reporting on feature stories and spending time with your main characters and sources, you need to be able to pick up on the nuance. You need to be able to hear what people are talking about. Those aren't things that can be done if I don't speak the language. So that's something that we're very clear about. But the way that we try to get around that is obviously hiring Indigenous reporters from those regions. And the problem with that is that we're having a hard time finding a lot of people to do that. It's taken a whole year for us to get a Sami reporter out of Norway. And now we're really getting some great material that's coming in. But it took us almost a year of going to 3 different countries to try and find people who would be able to report for us. So being able to, that's just one part of the world, right? So, being able to get anything out of Indonesia or get anything out of DRC, these are massive hurdles that we more or less don't have the resources or labor to handle at the moment. But ideally is where our ambitions are, is making sure that we are connected to those outlets and connected to those people, and being really clear that we are not looking for the top tier reporter out of DRC. We're looking for anybody who we can work with, and we're willing to train, and we're willing to make sure that we're investing time and resources, even if that's 18 edits that I need to do on that story and we're going to get the good story. I'm going to do that because it's that important to do. But that is more or less a resource conversation. So this is all to say we're massively under-resourced to be able to handle Indigenous reporting in Indigenous communities around the world.
We're in the same boat, very much so. I'm the only Indigenous reporter in our staff. Our editors are all white. My old boss, Karen, was Indigenous. I got some great mentorship from her for a year, but now she's gone. So I'm kind of alone in these kind of moral conscious questions about parachuting, very much kind of on me, and that versus speed of the news cycle is, can be very complicated, especially because we're a national publication. So I'm writing right across many nations. So for me, it's always a kind of return question about, is this my position to write on this story? Constantly self-questioning, even to the point, luckily my boss is in the other room, but, sometimes I will, or my ex-boss is in the other room, but sometimes I'll even, if I'm speaking with somebody in the grassroots, I'll even share some quotes with them before publication. I know it's controversial, but I want to get the story right, and I'd rather take that time, and I'd rather kind of break those or bend those rules a little bit to make sure I put out something that is not, totally offensive or something that's just low quality. It's a kind of self-education, if you will, because I just don't have that Indigenous mentorship in my organization, and a lot of times, my editors don't have, a lot of experience with Indigenous communities. So, it's one of the ways where, I could talk to my subjects and I could really, try to put something out that is quality and not something that's just an assumption. So, yeah.
There are so many challenges in covering Indian country and indigenous peoples in general. Language, of course, is a big one from an institutional standpoint. Having Native Americans in the U.S., for example, on staff, upping the number of just people we have in the organization that can help guide stories. That's a really big one. The example I'm going to give, though, is actually one more from the perspective of a tribe. One of the stories I'm most proud of last year is a couple of stories looking at the Kiowa tribe in Peru and a carbon credits scheme program in this national park where Shell, several other companies buy carbon credits, which, as you may know, maybe not, it basically is a way of canceling out emissions, right? You plant a tree somewhere and that you can, say that you cancel out X amount of emissions, right? There are a number of carbon credit schemes around the world, and that's a whole other story. But there's this major one in a national park in Peru that is problematic on lots of levels, and that our story focused on that. Is it really canceling out the carbon that it says and stuff like that? But a central part of the story was Kiowa tribe that says they were removed from this land. And so they're not benefiting from the program. They haven't seen any money from it the last 15 years, and it's brought in, I don't know, $800 million or something. And they say this is their land. Well, the part of their land was a really big reporting challenge for our team there, because their perspective on how they prove their land is very different than what the Peruvian government says, and I think a lot different than, a Western mindset would be like, well, where's your document? How can you show that this was your land? And so the way that we overcame that in the reporting was spend a lot of time interviewing people who could then speak about elders and the things that they did on land in particular areas that helped prove their side, that they actually were there, that they knew these places, that they were there hundreds of years ago. And so that, combined with getting perspectives on this particular tribe from experts that kind of help us put those two things together to really show their point of view. And I think we pretty distinctively proved that they do have a claim to this land, and they've since gone on and have filed lawsuits. Unfortunately, one was thrown out on a technicality, and they're filing again. But that was a real challenge, because it's not a court of law kind of thing where it's like, well, what about this document and this? It's basically people's word, against a government that says they have documents. And so that was a challenge that we overcome, and I was really proud of that work.
So one of my big challenges is myself. I think when you've been a reporter for a long time, what happens is, you've done thousands of interviews, and I know that I've done this. I've gone crashing into an interview situation and just said, okay, I have a tape recorder rolling. Can you start with your name and job title? And then they go, now wait, are we going live on the air? And I'm thinking, oh man, did I ever not brief this person very well? And that's a real impediment to building relationships. And the thing about covering the Native community, the other thing to remember is that, you do a story, and it's maybe the only time that person's ever going to get interviewed in their life. And it'll get broadcast, or it'll be aired. People will read it, and it'll be the talk of the town. And inadvertently, you can just really harm people. And so I'd say that's one challenge, is just constantly reminding yourself to take the time, both in the individual interview situation and also in remembering that this is a long-term relationship. You'd like to be able to interview this person 20 times and, know them really well, know the name of their dog, have an actual relationship and be friends and have them respect your work and call you up with tips and background information and that kind of thing. So that's one challenge. As far as language, we had, Tristan was on this panel last year. You remember the Navajo guy, and you were,
Yeah.
and he spoke so beautifully about water is life, and he described the words and all the different ways in which it's used. I had a similar interview with somebody in Hawaii, and they also use the word for water is life. And if you can take time out occasionally to do a feature with someone, you know, whatever the resource issue is, if it's a resource issue, whatever the issue is, try to find somebody who can speak to it, and either in the context of place names or just you know, values, that kind of thing. That's one way to bring traditional values and language into the discussion. So, but that's a challenge again of time, finding the time and making it a priority.
Thank you, Joaqlin. Well, my challenge as a Pacific Islander journalist is everyone's related in some way or another, and that falls directly under AP's conflict of interest situation. So it's not funny because I won awards for my reporting in the Pacific because of my sources, but when you translate that to the ethical standards of global media, you cannot interview, you know, the person that you dated in high school. Or your mom's cousin who's the Minister of Environment. But that's like a challenge across the Pacific Islands and across communities that are small, especially Indigenous communities. The ties are much closer. But then it begs the question of ethics, like that wasn't taken into consideration when you set these standards, that actually as an Indigenous reporter who will do the most justice to the story of your community, you are in fact not allowed to cover your community because of those very ethical issues. So I think finding a balance, that's where I'm seeing right now, just being in the US for only 3 years outside of my community, just seeing where do we find that balance where you can do justice to the story, the climate story of Indigenous communities without compromising your ethical standards, especially those imposed by your organization. And I think another challenge that's worth noting here is if you really want to cover the climate story from Indigenous perspective, you have to find Indigenous expert voices, and those are rare. Rare in that they're not usually either available or are in a situation where they don't really want to comment. But as a journalist, you really have to try to find the experts that come from those communities so that you can get that, not just the scientific expert, but their knowledge of their community as part of the, you know, of the quotes that they're giving you. I'm going to open the floor for another question. Sure, please. I heard you laugh really loud, sir.
how to stay optimistic in the face of the coming calamity. Yeah. Well, I would say that for me, it's really talking to elders and interviewing them. They've been through so much and can speak to that and talk about the fortitude of our people.
I hear you. I feel like all the provinces have conservative premiers at this point, which often means, in Ontario they say it's open for business. So it's tough, right? And I think, as a reporter, it's tough because we're also isolated. We're on our islands, and in the craft of journalism, we're told, objectivity rules. You can't have any kind of flares of opinions. Sometimes when you try to put a line in, maybe the editor will hold you back. But for me, I think what keeps me going, with the long hours and the burnout and et cetera, is the political commitment and the political obligation to writing about these topics. And having long conversations with those experts that we're talking with an elder. And for me is just having those conversations, and oftentimes that might take off-the-record conversations, which are all very much refreshing, to get away from that just kind of professionalization as well, and just being tapped into what's going on. It's doom and gloom, but then you see some work that people are doing, whether they're organizing or you might cover a demonstration, or you just talk with experts about what's going on in different industries. So with more knowledge, it can go more doom and gloom, but maybe you could find a little space to put your eye to and report on.
I may have sounded like Debbie Downer at the beginning of this, but I actually am quite hopeful about change that can be made in the future. But it's a complicated hope in that there are very easy solutions to the climate crisis. How we get there is the hard part, but I do think of my job as being a person who needs to be finding the stories that can illuminate different ways to be thinking. Like if I'm continuing to reinforce, like, you have two options, like, it's Burger King or McDonald's, which one are you into? Like, that doesn't actually help with any like reporting on any sort of, on any topic whatsoever. But, it's only been in the last 20 years that there's been such a shift in people actually believing that climate change is real, right? Like, it's like a high percentage of like people in the US now believe that climate change is real. It's much higher than it was 20 years ago, right? People are changing the way that they think about things. Everything, we see it all the time now. It's even like war on woke culture and everything else, is that people are changing the way that they're thinking. And I think as part of our job is to help encourage people to think differently about what the world can be. So I am actually quite hopeful that the world can be a different place. I may not be hopeful about exactly how we get there or when we get there, but we will get there. It may take something that's cataclysmic to get us there, but there will be a change. And I do think it's our job to help push that change through as fast as possible. And offer different ideas and different solutions that can help people think differently about what a just future can actually look like.
I share Tristan's view that that there's a lot of hope out there. I have a lot of hope, particularly when I see a lot of the younger generations, the way that they think about sustainability, consumerism, activism. So I have a lot of hope there. There's a lot of really interesting technological things going on as well that I think we can't lose sight of. And then to your point, just the level of knowledge that people have about climate change. I would say it's changed drastically even in the last 5 years. AP does a lot of polling. We do a couple polls every year now, focused on climate change, and you see the numbers go up of people who say they've been part of a climate-infused event. You see the numbers go up of them demanding more from their government in terms of policy change. So I do think, the question is, how fast are we changing? Is it fast enough? A lot of people will argue, of course, no. And we see that just in the last couple of months, right? All these kind of climate-infused events. I was telling Cherelle a little bit earlier today, I feel like an extreme weather editor the last 2 months particularly, because it's just been relentless. And but that level of consciousness, I think, is what probably gives me hope the most.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Just quickly, I just want to piggyback on that. It is changing. We were just presented polling in our newsroom. The majority of Canadians believe in climate change, but majority of Canadians also believe that the climate transition can take place while still extracting natural gas. So, I mean, that's where like you and I come in, right? Is like there's still disinformation. Like this is our role. So.
Thank you. So I think it's a thank you everyone for answering that question. Very important thing to note is that when climate change became a mainstream topic in the news media, it was very much about doom and gloom. We're all dying, the world is ending, all of the polar bears are going to die. And that was the image of the climate crisis, was melting ice caps. It is encouraging to note that that has shifted very much now. If you read international media coverage of climate, is that there is a more kind of dynamic and diverse coverage, and that communities are being covered. And the different way that the climate crisis is impacting Indigenous communities in particular is now receiving attention. Whereas 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would not see the impacts of, say, the climate crisis on, on a coastal community in India. Now you can, do a search and something's been covered from those communities within the past 2 weeks. So there is an encouraging trend in terms of the broad spectrum of coverage and the inclusion of minorities and Native communities around the world. Now, I'm going to appeal to my panelists' radio experience. Now, I know Joaqlin's a radio person, so I have full faith in her ability to do this next exercise, but my Prince fellow journalists, the three of them there, I would like for you to give us 2 quick tips, because we're in the last 5 minutes. What are like 2 quick tips you would give a journalist who's starting out in the climate beat? How can they consider and be ensure that they're considerate of Indigenous communities in the way that they cover climate? Very simple, right? So 2 quick tips. Or really any tips on covering climate at this point?
Well, I would just say practice your craft and keep at it. I mean, everything that we're talking about, or what I want to emphasize is that this is long-term, and you can devote yourself to it, and it's going to sustain you, and there's a lot there, and it's very rewarding.
I'm just glad you didn't ask us to sing. I thought for a while
sing.
you were doing that like you wanted us to sing.
No one is stopping you.
No, I'm not going to do that. So keeping it specific to in covering Indigenous peoples, I would say one of the most important things for me has been listening. It's just trying to learn as much as I can. I'm obviously not Native American, or maybe not obviously, but I'm not Native American. So I don't have that background, and I never will, and I don't want to pretend that I do, but I can learn a lot just by listening, and I think that's really important for all of us as reporters. So that for covering Indian country, and then for climate change, I'd say read widely, books, articles, academic blogs, because it's a very interesting, nuanced, complicated story, and I think to be able to consider stories, you really need a wide background to have a broad canvas to really look at stories.
Just quickly, I'm only here right now because I was applying to things. I applied to an internship and I got it. If I didn't get that, maybe I'd still be a waiter or a server, and that was only 2 years ago. So apply to everything and just keep working. And then covering Indigenous communities, I'm still not an expert. I've only been doing this for a year. I'm still very much learning. So piggyback, listening, find your mentors, learn protocol.
Yeah, I think one thing is that looking at recent polls, that climate reporting is the widest beat in reporting right now. I mean, that's I can't remember who did the poll, but it's more or less dominated by non-native people reporting on climate. I think it's incumbent on all of us to be making major changes in our newsrooms and pushing for change in our newsrooms at every single level, from management on down, to make sure that the voices represented covering climate are representative of the people who are actually impacted the most by climate. You know, and otherwise, I think collaboration is really one of the big things that folks need to be thinking about. Is that you know, we can really build a lot more global solidarity by finding connections across political borders that really help us find projects and determine projects by us and for us that really advance you know, our coverage of climate change.
Thank you. I'm pretty impressed that they kept it under 2 minutes each. Well done. I think radio is in your future, guys. My tip is very simple. If you're going into a community, an Indigenous community, to report, understand the cultural protocol, especially if you're interviewing a chief or an elder. Understand where you stand, you sit, the words you use, and how you address them at first. That determines the value of the information that you receive. It sounds straightforward, but that's something that, you know, it's really, really important that if you're not of that community, that you understand it. I now take this opportunity to thank you all for coming to our talk, our panel this afternoon. Really engaged audience, beautiful faces to look at while talking. So thank you so much for actually not sleeping through any part of this. Like, I think as an audience, you guys did great. So really appreciate it. Let's clap for you. And then on behalf of the Associated Press, I also want to relay our gratitude to you, Tristan, Matteo, and Joaqlin, for being here. I'm speaking on behalf of Peter and I, as AP, Corinne, and our team in the room. So can we give them a round of applause? Thank you.